Barossa says it was a monster who was amphibious, who lived in an underwater base. The purification priest of Adapa says that they were part of authorities in the sky. I think we have language that describes this in modern terms. We are talking about the intersection of our human ancestors with a non-human presence on planet Earth that came from the heavens, that came from the sky, what today we would call extraterrestrials. Prior to 10,000 years ago, our ancestors were talking about ET contact as the missing key in the story that explains how Homo sapiens made its great leap forward. Why would the Zulu people, the Dogon people, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Mesoamericans, the Native Americans, the First Nation Australians all want to say, we learnt this from non-humans, from people who came from Sirius, from people who came from the Pleiades? I argue that the exact same claims can be found in the pages of the Bible when you read the stories according to the root meanings of key words. This is not just a one-off story from an individual culture, it's the report of cultures from all around the world. Before we get into today's content, a quick word from our sponsor. It's a product I use personally every day because, and full disclosure, it's my wife's small business.
Looking for the perfect grooming solution? Discover Ooze for Men. Handcrafted with 100% natural and organic ingredients. Our shaving and grooming collection offers a luxurious, gentle experience for the discerning modern man. Get the cleanest, closest shave every time, even on sensitive skin. Elevate your routine with elegance and functionality. Visit www.seemycurls.com.au. Get yours today.
Australia, the world's most remote island continent, home to the world's most unique ecosystem of flora and fauna. Australia is also home to the world's longest continuous cultural presence. First Nations Australians have occupied the continent for tens of thousands of years. The current consensus places the First Nation Australians on the Australian continent for at least 60,000 years, and the archaeological evidence is from that stretch from north to south. But more recent finds, the find of a hearth and evidence of aquaculture in southern Victoria, suggest that presence could extend twice as far into history, back 120,000 years before present. Now, in some circles that's controversial, but evidence of the use of fire takes us back at least 400,000 years, and some would suggest 1.4 million years on planet Earth, albeit in the company of our predecessors, Java Man, aka Pithecanthropus, aka Homo erectus. But it raises a very interesting question of how far back does human memory extend? How far back does the memory of Homo sapiens take us? Do we have a cultural memory of events prior to the most recent planetary cataclysm? Can we remember what life was like before the last ice age? And do we have any memory of the great leap forward that took humanity from living in subsistence on the planet's surface to farming and city building? The current scholarly consensus is that humanity made its great leap forward from foraging, hunting and gathering and subsistence living on the land about 10,000 years ago, at the end of the most recent ice age, the Younger Dryas Cold Period. The leap was the genetic modification of naturally occurring plants to turn them into cultivatable crops. In the same moment, humanity discovered the art of animal husbandry. The result was farming, the capacity to enable greater population densities to thrive, specialize, build towns and cities. In 1998, Manfred Hoyne took a team from the University of Norway in As and the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Germany, to excavate what they believe is the first farm in human history. And they identified this site where they argued that one tribe, or it may have been one family, discovered how to do gene manipulation on 11 naturally occurring plants to turn them into cultivatable crops. And at the same time, they discovered how to do animal husbandry. So there we have the first farm, animal husbandry, agriculture, Southeast Turkey, 10,000 years ago. It requires phenomenal information and skill to make that leap. I used to live on the farm that belonged to William Farrer, who took 20 years with all the advantage of 19th century science, and had grown up on a farm in Britain, 20 years to work out how to do the gene manipulation to turn the already cultivatable British wheat into a wheat that could be cultivated in Australia's harsh climate. 20 years for one plant. This family did it 11 times over and invented animal husbandry at the same time. And so the question is, did they do it on their own, or did they have help? And if they had help, was it from a previous human civilization, or was it from someone else? Researcher and best-selling author Graham Hancock argues that this ancient tutelage in agricultural science came from a previous human population, the remnant of a prior advanced civilization. Were our ancestors helped by the remnant of a previous human civilization? Or at this moment, and we're coming out of a cataclysm that has lasted from 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago, we're emerging from the most recent ice age, which brought its own cataclysms to the planet. This is a moment when the survival of Homo sapiens hung in the balance. So this is a very decisive moment for someone else to make an input if they want to assist. Did that assistance come from the remnant of a previous pre-Younger Dryas civilization, or did it come from elsewhere? Did it come from off-planet? Did it come from cosmic neighbors who cared about the progress of life on Earth? I would suggest it depends where you look. If you go to India and look in the Gulf of Cambay, you will find the megalithic remains of a lost city. Look off the coast of Yonaguni-jima of Japan, or off the coast of Malta or Cuba. Again, there are the remains of megalithic cities that would have been above sea level no more recently than 10,000 years ago. But wait a minute. Those cities existed before what Manfred Hoyne identified as the Great Leap Forward at Karakadag. That means before this sudden advance to being able to farm and build cities and become a civilization, there were already cities existing. So it's worth flagging that and saying, yes, there is evidence of a previous civilization. And so it's entirely possible that survivors of those earlier cities would have assisted people living out in the wilderness, foraging for their survival, and providing the information from a pre-Younger Dryas Cold period culture to assist with human survival for the long term. And those megalithic sites I mentioned are not the only sites on planet Earth that suggest a previous human civilization. Robert Schoch, Associate Professor of Natural Sciences at Boston University, argues that erosion patterns on the Sphinx on Egypt's Giza Plain push its construction much further back than has been conventionally accepted, to between 10 and 13,000 years ago. Again, it's that rather interesting period in the planet's history. But put all those together and you've got megalithic sites illustrating the presence of a civilization prior to 10,000 years ago, prior to the Great Leap Forward that we identify at the top of the Fertile Crescent. Once again, we're in that interesting node in human history. It aligns with the obliteration of the Clovis culture on the North American continent by the Clovis comet 12,800 years before present. The erosion of the Sphinx pushes us back to 12 to 13,000 years ago. The flooding of the coastal cities of Japan, India, Cuba, and Malta, again 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. For me, the best smoking gun evidence is Göbekli Tepe, because that's just a few hundred miles from Karakodag, and it is a megalithic site. And it would seem to be the tail end of a megalithic society, because around 8,000 years ago, it was buried very carefully for its preservation. And so you've got the tail end of a megalithic society over here, and then over here, this family working out how to farm for the first time. It would seem entirely possible that people from here would travel here and give this family at Karakodag a little assistance. And I would suggest that that is exactly what happened. And so it may be that some of our world's ancestral narratives that speak of this time 10,000 years ago are remembering a period of human-to-human assistance, as Graham Hancock proposes. It's circumstantial, it may be coincidental, but for me those intersecting timelines do support the idea that our ancestors 10,000 years ago may have been assisted by the survivors of a previous civilization. Interestingly, that's exactly what Plato proposes when he brings forward information from ancient Egypt, which he heard via the Greek legislator Solon, a real historical character. He said that the expertise of the ancient Egyptians had been gleaned from a previous civilization who met their demise 9,000 years before that time. That puts us exactly in the same timeline, 11,500 years ago. So I think there are many reasons for supporting Graham Hancock's thesis that our ancestors, when they made their great leap forward, were assisted by the survivors of a previous human culture. So you might ask, so Paul, why do you say it's ETs? And the reason I think that ETs were involved in previous leaps forward is that, as well as archaeological evidence, we have the evidence of the world's canon of indigenous narratives. And in my book, The Eden Conspiracy, I argue that the world's canon of ancestral narratives, including the books of the Bible, when translated according to root meanings, that they point towards ancient ET contact who had helped our species prior to 10,000 years ago. Ancient Babylon and Sumeria, ancient Greece, Central and South America, Mali, Benin, Nigeria, Southern Africa and Australia all carry rich traditions of ancestral memory. It is in these ancient indigenous narratives that our ancestors speak of an earlier tutelage, an earlier intervention in the human story, interventions by non-human helpers, what today we would call ETs. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Greek priest Berossus wrote down the Babylonian explanation of the Great Leap Forward, and he tells the story of beings called Oannes and the Apkallu. Now, we know about these beings not just from Berossus, but from 2 other Sumerian sources. One is Adapa, the purification priest of Eridu, and that's the account of a priest who experienced an abduction up into the sky. And the other source is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written narrative known to humanity. They all refer to Oannes and the Apkallu emerging and teaching our ancestors all the rudiments of agronomy and city building. Now this is how Berossus describes Oannes, an extraordinary monster first witnessed on the shore of the Red Sea. Its entire body appeared like that of a fish, and underneath the head was a second head, like that of a man. His appearance is still remembered and depicted to this day. This being taught people writing, geometry, science, and technology of all kinds, the civil engineering for city building, legal systems. He taught us how to cultivate grains and harvest fruits. In short, he provided everything that constitutes the marks of a civilization. Every sunset, the monster would return into the sea, where it lived under the waves, being amphibious. Later, 7 similar beings appeared. Their role was to manage Earth according to plans made in the sky. That last sentence was actually from Adapa, the purification priest of Eridu, the one who was abducted into the sky, and it's a very interesting phrase. And he relates these ancient tutors to powers in the sky, powers in space, who are interested in the progress of Project Earth and Project Humanity. Now, I would suggest that if we're describing monsters who come from space to help manage planet Earth, I think today we would call that ET contact. I realize some might say to me, well, that's a bit of a leap. After all, listen to that description, one face and below it another human face. That description of a monster could be the description of a human being wearing a wetsuit that allows him to get to his underwater base. Could be a human being wearing a spacesuit, and it's a space helmet with a human face under it. It doesn't have to be a non-human that you're looking at. Well, I would say, give our ancestors some credit. I understand why you would say that, especially looking at the carvings as later artists have sought to interpret what Berossus said. Yes, you might think perhaps that was some kind of a suit that these ancient humans were wearing that our ancestors didn't understand. But I would say give our ancestors a bit of credit, because divers who dive among dolphins and seals and sea lions will tell you those animals can tell what is equipment, what is clothing, and what is their actual body. And if an animal can work out what is a suit and what is a body, I think we should credit our ancestors with the same intelligence and listen to what they're saying. Now you might say, I'm going to listen, but I don't have to take it literally. That's okay, but let them say what they're saying. Berossus says it was a monster who was amphibious, who lived in an underwater base. The purification priest of Adapa says that they were part of authorities in the sky. I think we have language that describes this in modern terms. We are talking about the intersection of our human ancestors with a non-human presence on planet Earth that came from the heavens, that came from the sky, what today we would call extraterrestrials. And the story of Berossus is that many thousands of years ago, prior to 10,000 years ago, our ancestors were talking about ET contact as the missing key in the story that explains how Homo sapiens made its great leap forward. If you enjoy our content here on Fifth Kind TV and would like to support our work, please would you consider subscribing to our new website, fifthkind.tv. Here we will have our full catalogue of material along with exclusive access to interviews and documentary content. Sign up today, become part of the community, become part of the conversation. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you there. Similarly to the Berossus account, the ancient Philistines of the biblical story described Dagon in exactly the same terms as Oannes and the Apkallu. Dagon was an amphibious, reptilian monster who tutored their ancestors in the secrets of agricultural science. And the Philistines never suggested that Dagon was human. Similar, if you go to the Dogon people of Mali, West Africa, when they talk about their ancient tutors, the Nomos, they speak about amphibious beings based on Earth, but whose origins are in the sky, and they're specific about what part of the sky they came from the Sirius star system. In a similar vein, Native American narratives among the Cherokee and Lakota nations credit visitors from the Pleiades. So I think when our ancestors give a physical description of our visitors, which is what we have from the Babylonians, the Philistines, and the Dogon people, we should listen to that with respect. When our ancestors say they had underwater bases here, but they originated in the Pleiades and Sirius, we should listen to that with respect. Those are not stories of a previous human civilization. They are stories of what today we would call extraterrestrial contact. But how far back did these prior interventions in the human story occur? For me, this is where the antiquity of the First Nation Australian stories becomes so exciting, because here we have a cultural memory that goes back prior to the most recent ice age. In fact, before a certain mining company was allowed to blow up the Juukan Gorge a couple of years ago, there was hard copy evidence of this cultural memory from before the last ice age, the Younger Dryas Cold period, during and after. So original Australian memory goes back prior to Göbekli Tepe, prior to the Sphinx, prior to the cities off the coasts of India, Japan, Malta, and Cuba, way back 60,000 years ago, and maybe even earlier. And when they talk about their great leap forward, it is certainly not a human-to-human story they're telling. The Northern Territory, what we call the top end, is home to the Yolngu people. And they tell an amazing story, which I believe is a much earlier Great Leap Forward story than we hear from Berossus. When I first heard this story, I was amazed, because original Australians are renowned for their connection with their land and their expertise at living in balance with the land. And yet here is a story that says, there was a time when our Yolngu elders did not know how to hunt or to fish. They did not know which plants were good for food and which were good to avoid, which berry to eat if a woman wanted to have a baby, which berry to eat if a woman did not want to get pregnant. We did not know how to live in balance with the land. But there were others who were here on the land before us, the Mimi spirits. The Mimi spirits came and danced with our ancestors, and through their dance, they taught us how to hunt and fish, which plant was good for food, which was good for medicine, which was good to avoid, what berry to eat if you wanted a baby, what berry to eat if you didn't want to get pregnant. And through the dance, our ancestors learned these things, and we established ourselves in the land. It's a surprising story. It's not a story that's been invented to honor the ancient elders, but rather to say, no, our expertise came from somewhere else, came from a non-human source. And don't be misled by the name Mimi spirits. When we hear the word spirits, we think of a non-physical, will-o'-the-wisp kind of entity that might not even be real. But in many ancient cultures around the world, the word spirit simply means a being who can turn up and vanish in ways we don't understand, a being with an advanced ability to turn up and depart, whether that's through technology, through a portal-like phenomenon, through a technological phenomenon. A spirit is simply a being who turns up and helps, and you're not quite sure where he or she came from. Now, the Mimi spirits in the Yolngu story don't share a common language with the human beings present, and so they communicate through dance. Now, this could mean many things. When it says that our ancestors observed the dance of the Mimi spirits. It could simply be they observed their behavior and learned from them. They watched their physical activities and learned from them. And so they learned from the dance of the hunt and the dance of the fishing and the dance of the gathering and food preparation. They learned from these other beings. Now, they were certainly not human beings. And a clue that they were not will-o'-the-wisp spirits and they were not human is that the Yolngu people remember the Mimi spirits for their physicality being very different. They were far taller than us. They were incredibly slender. And it was this different physicality that first drew the interest of the Yolngu people. And it was physical modalities that they learned from the Mimi spirits. Hunting is a physical activity. Fishing, physical activity. Gathering foods and preparing them, physical activity. This is what the Yolngu people learned from the Mimi spirits. Now, there's a very interesting story told just to one side of Australia in Papua New Guinea by the Labu people, a story that is embedded in the Yahapa dialect. Now, my Eden series books are all about the treasures of information to be found in root meanings of words. And in the Yahapa dialect, you go to the numbers 1 to 5, and you will find that a story is embedded into those words. Number 1, Toguato, means friends in a ship. Number 2, Salu, means moon school. Number 3, Sede, means spirit dance. Number 4, Soha, is a needle with a container. Number 5, Maipi, spirit goes up. In comparison with other world ancestral narratives, that's a familiar story. Friends in a ship, moon school. This is about beings coming from the stars and educating us. How do they educate us without a shared language? Spirit dance. The same story as told by the Yolngu people. Now follows something really enigmatic. And the word for spirit dance, Sede, is very similar to an ancient Celtic word. It's pronounced She, but it's spelt very close to Sede, and it refers to the interaction between the spirit world and the material world. And so this idea of spirit dance might hint at all kinds of contact experiences, from very intimate physical contact to more mysterious altered states kind of contact with other dimensions. All that is carried by this mysterious word Sede, spirit dance. And it's here in the Labu story, in the Yahapa dialect, and it's there in ancient Celtic story too, and of course in the original Australian stories of the Dreamtime. Next comes something very intriguing indeed, the Soha, the needle plus container. Now, if I say a needle with a container, you're picturing a hypodermic syringe. Why on earth would ancient indigenous people need a word for hypodermic syringe? And what does it represent? It represents medication, science. This is what we're learning through the moon school and the spirit dance. There is a new technology that we're being exposed to in some kind of way. And after this interaction, human to non-human interaction, Maipi, spirit goes up, back up into the sky. Now, this narrative of ancient visitations and interaction and even alteration by visitors from the stars repeats in ancestral narratives all around the world. And that's what I explore in the Eden Conspiracy and my other Eden books. And it's the correlations across these stories from cultures all around the world that make me believe what we are listening to is cultural memory that takes us way prior to the Great Leap of 10,000 years ago into the timeline of 60,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago, because that Yongu story is talking of a time when our ancestors did not have very basic human skills: how to hunt, how to fish. And I would suggest we're looking at an intervention that enabled us to become Homo sapiens as we know ourselves. Why would these disparate cultures all choose independently not to give the credit to their ancestral elders for the genius of the Great Leap Forward? Why would the Zulu people, the Dogon people, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Mesoamericans, the Native Americans, the First Nation Australians all want to say, we learnt this from non-humans, from people who came from Sirius, from people who came from the Pleiades? In my book, The Eden Conspiracy, I argue that the exact same claims can be found in the pages of the Bible when you read the stories of Asherah and Dagon according to the root meanings of key words. This is not just a one-off story from an individual culture, it's the report of cultures from all around the world. And so when we're asking, were we assisted by previous human civilization or by ETs, I think the answer is both, according to where and when you look. And I think if you look at archaeological evidence, then you'll get to 10,000 years ago and you'll see the dovetailing of two timelines for civilization. You'll get to a moment when our ancestors did have help from previous human cultures. Go further back, and I think that's when the story of ancient ET contact emerges. And we get to that story by listening to the ancestral narratives of indigenous peoples all around the world. And that's the approach I take in the Eden series, uncovering this forgotten layer of story. When we listen to ancestral narrative without seeing it through the lens of fiction and fable, I believe there is a catalogue of cultural memory to enrich our understanding of who we are. Our ancestors wanted us to know that in the past, we had the profoundest and most important help from cosmic neighbors. They wanted us to know we are not alone. We have company. We have been visited many times in the past. Cosmic help has always been available and probably still is today.